Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak at the Accountability in a Sustainable World conference. My name is Sandra, and I'm an assistant professor of accounting at the Wharton School. And today I discuss insights from a paper titled The Spillover Effects of Environmental Transparency Enforcement Regulation, Evidence from Commodity Trading Firms. Now, the motivation of this paper is pretty broad in that firm-level operating activities can induce negative environmental externalities. We can think about global greenhouse gas emissions, but also more specifically, biodiversity loss or deforestation. Now, there are various policy solutions that aim to address these environmental impacts, such as the implementation of carbon prices or carbon taxes, but also regulations related to climate disclosure laws or climate transparency laws. Now, unfortunately, these regulations, what they all have in common is that they're typically limited in scope. That means that only a subset of firms or firm operations are affected. And as a consequence, prior research has found that there can be negative unintended consequences, in which firms would reallocate their activities from regulated to unregulated areas. Now, in this paper, I study the interplay between local environmental regulation, that in my case is a shock to transparency enforcement actions, and I study the transmission effects on midstream supply chain actors, so-called commodity trading firms. To understand the setting and to highlight the commodity supply chain in a little bit more detail, I've illustrated it here in a simplified manner. So the commodity flow is going from upstream to downstream activities. And the key value-added steps associated with the commodity flow are commodity production in the beginning. We can think about the raising of cattle or the plantation of soybeans, such as in an agricultural commodity supply chain. Then we have storage, transportation, trade, and distribution, and then subsequently manufacturing, retail, and consumption activities. The key agents associated with these key value-added steps are producers of flowers in the first place. Then we have commodity trading firms in the midstream, so the middleman position. And then subsequently we have food manufacturers, restaurants, and retailers. Now, instead of illustrating the supply chain in terms of the direction of the commodity flow, we can also think about the interactions among key agents and their relationship dynamics. And what we can see here is that the arrow actually flips, especially when we think about these upstream and midstream interactions. That is that these commodity trading firms typically have the upper hand over their producers, meaning they have the bargaining power in this relationship. And in this paper, I really focus on the economic agent of this commodity trading firm, and I really want to understand and highlight their role as an intermediary firm in commodity supply chains. And the local environmental regulation that I have in mind is actually implemented at the upstream, at the producer level. But this, of course, suggests that the regulation does not directly affect commodity trading firms. It indirectly affects them through their sourcing activities. So taking this all together, in this paper, I investigated whether commodity trading firms changed their behavior after the local environmental regulation in terms of reallocating the sourcing activities, but also investing in sustainability outcomes. Now, what's the setting in a nutshell? I will talk about deforestation in Brazil, and the soybean commodity supply chain. In terms of deforestation, it contributes to greenhouse gas emission. Estimates suggest between 12 and 20%, and therefore contributes to climate change directly. It also contributes to species extinction, biodiversity loss, soil erosion, disruption of water cycles, and there's many more direct but mostly indirect other consequences. When we think about deforestation, we also should think about Brazil, because Brazil is home to the world's largest rainforest, which is actually threatened by deforestation activities, particularly because of commodity production trade. And here, the main drivers are beef and soybeans. So soybeans drive deforestation activities in Brazil, but Brazil is also the largest exporter of soybeans globally. And as a consequence, of course, we look here at an economically important setting. In this setting, Brazil implemented the priority regulation, and that was rolled out in 2008. Under this regulation, these municipalities, so that's basically the smallest level of administrative level in Brazil, that have the worst deforestation outcomes are targeted through transparency and enforcement checks by the federal government. I've highlighted the municipalities that were targeted in red on the slide. Now, the question, of course, is what do commodity trading firms have to do with deforestation in Brazil? And how can they change sustainability outcomes? And I argue in my paper that they have the ability to shape local production practices, and those arguments have been made in prior work. In fact, these traders assume the role as lenders or as banks by providing about 60% of total financing to soybean producers. And they also make substantial investments in local infrastructure, such as ports and railways and highways, and other storage facilities, such as silos. So what this shows is that they are incredibly connected to the local source location and to their producers. However, these in-person interactions are typically limited to financial and operational transactions. So there's no clear incentive to actually monitor producers or invest in sustainability mechanisms absent any regulatory or stakeholder pressure. And this is also highlighted in the following statement by one of the grain traders in their 10K in 2008. They state that the company's raw materials are procured from thousands of growers, grain elevators, and wholesale merchants. And those agreements are pursuant to short-term contracts that are typically less than 1 year or on a spot basis. Now, the priority regulation that I look at in this paper functions as an upstream supply chain shock in that it directly affects producers, but it can have spillover effects onto commodity trading firms. It induces, as I argue, current, but also future expected costs linked to deforestation regulation. Mostly it increases transaction costs because of increased uncertainty and strict enforcement related to environmental regulation that now traders have to navigate around, but it also increases compliance costs, litigation costs, and reputational costs. And this broader bundle of costs can, of course, change traders' behavior. And I argue that they would possibly reallocate away from or into regulated areas. They might also adjust the sourcing within unregulated areas. Here, mostly the argument is because of future expected costs of regulation. And they might invest in sustainability improvements. Now, to test these hypotheses, I use a panel of firm municipality observations, and the key data comes from trades. Now, what's important here to outline is that because firms source from various locations at the same time, I can actually test for the effects in firms' regulated locations, but also firms' unregulated locations to really make statements and inferences about this firm-wide spillover effect. Now, I want to talk through the main results, the key results, and I have 4 key results. The first key result is related to volume reallocation. At the granular municipality level, I find firms do not relocate their sourcing operations away from regulated municipalities, and I confirm this at the more aggregate level. But I do find that traders relocate their sourcing within unregulated areas to locations that actually have a higher potential for deforestation reduction. That means there's more available land for agricultural expansion, and they would relocate away from locations that have a lower potential for deforestation reduction. I interpret these findings as such that regulated municipalities actually allow traders to capitalize on sustainability gains, which are induced, of course, by the priority regulation directly affecting producers. The large capital investments that traders make at the local level suggest that there's actually not much room for swift reallocation to new areas that can be actually pretty costly. And then in addition, the expected cost of future regulation related to deforestation might prompt these increases in sourcing in areas that are actually related to lower deforestation exposure. Now, the second key result is related to the sustainability outcomes. Here, I find that traders' exposure to deforestation and greenhouse gas emissions reduce in both the regulated, and that's now important, also in unregulated municipalities, suggesting there's this firm-wide spillover effect. And I've plotted these effects in unregulated municipalities over time for both deforestation exposure and CO2 exposure on the slide. Now, I interpret these findings as follows. The sustainability improvements that I observed in regulated municipalities can be purely mechanical, so not at all surprising, as there are changes in producer operations that must not be related to traders' changes. However, the sustainability improvements in unregulated municipalities are likely because of two mechanisms. Either the reallocation into areas with lower deforestation exposure, so some sort of careful producer selection channel, or investments in sustainability. And because it's difficult to test for these effects directly and to also disentangle them, I've conducted interviews with key stakeholders in Brazil. And in one of the key interviews, I learned that traders also play an important role in regulated municipalities by actually putting restrictions on the sourcing of soybeans immediately when a priority regulation comes in place. And then they implement new quality control, such as the new quality control entity that's purely responsible for deforestation audits. Finally, in the fourth basically key result that I want to highlight, I highlight the mechanisms that result in this positive firm-wide spillover effect that I'm observing. And I find the following 3 channels are responsible for observing this positive effect. Pressure by external stakeholders, such as activists, investors and downstream firms, but also enforcement actions by the local environmental police in Brazil, such as the ex-ante exposure that firms experience, but also the ex-post exposure to deforestation enforcement actions that experience directly in their source locations. And then finally, firm characteristics that are either related to local investments in stable source relationships or zero deforestation commitments and investments in deforestation audits drive these firm-wide spillover effects. To conclude, I want to first highlight that in the global grain commodity market, a handful of traders dominate the majority of trade. They collectively control assets exceeding 260 billion and generating over 430 billion revenues alone in 2023, so they are important players. However, because of the opacity in which they typically operate, most of them are privately held and actually do not provide typical disclosures. And as a consequence, they lack a systematic understanding of their role, but also their incentives to shape sustainability outcomes in global commodity supply chains. Now, this paper sheds light on commodity traders' responses to a local environmental regulation that was implemented in Brazil that comes with strong transparency and enforcement actions, and thereby can highlight that there can be firm-wide spillover effects beyond effects in regulated locations. So I want to thank you so much again for allowing me to speak here at this conference today, and I hope this research provides some interesting insights.